Okay, well, I think we're ready to start here. It's really great to have everyone on this call. Hopefully, everyone uh, has knows James well. James has been a speaker at Society a number of times over the years. James just graduated with his PhD in biology uh, just a couple weeks ago, and then Daniel is a physics graduate student here. Are you graduating, or where are you, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm scheduled to graduate by this fall.
Okay, great. We're both very thoughtful, and I'm really excited to hear what you say. I'll hand the floor over to you, and then from there.
Okay.
All right. Before we begin, Daniel, I'm seeing these like black boxes in the screen. I don't know if other people are seeing it.
Yeah, I see it too. I think it's your computer I think there's probably windows that are over something.
Yeah, if you can close these windows, that'd be.
Do you still see them?
I still see like ones in the top right, and also in the top
How about this?
left. The top left, there's like another like larger rectangle. I think
Okay.
you shrink that just a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, this is weird.
Let me just close everything else just to.
There's still a gray box in the top left.
There might be a glitch of sharing your screen sometimes when you share your screen with Zoom, like the little dialog boxes on the control panel and stuff. You're not supposed to see it, but then sometimes it shows up on other people's screens with a black box. So it might be though if you drag them out of the way. Maybe that'll help.
Okay. Do you still see that, James? Let me just stop share and reshare.
Yeah. Sorry, Xavier. It's like so blurry on your end. I can't hear anything.
Can you can you see anything?
It's there. It's not that bad. So
Not that bad. Maybe we can just go
Yeah,
go
I
with
think
it.
we can probably just go.
Okay.
Okay,
I think
yeah,
it's just Zoom boxes that are.
All right,
blocking.
Daniel.
Okay.
I'm gonna request control again.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so before we begin, just to give a very brief background, so Daniel and I have been thinking about this topic for a while. Daniel in particular, so we're going to talk specifically about a genealogical model in this talk, and Daniel in particular has been in contact with the person that developed this model, Joshua Swamidass, and so he's been thinking about this topic for a while. And I have a personal interest in this topic, just being a molecular biologist myself, and really we're really excited to present on this idea and like go into like the theology and the science behind the historical Adam and Eve. And so for the overlay of the presentation, Daniel is going to focus more on developing the theological aspect, and I'm going to jump in and talk more about the science. And we're really excited to have everyone here today for this presentation. And I think like throughout the presentation, there's going to be quite a number of ideas thrown out. So if you have any questions, just feel free to stop us and interrupt. And our goal, this topic itself can be pretty confusing, especially on the science side. And so when I do present the science, feel free to just jump in and ask any clarifying questions, because I really want everyone to leave this talk having an understanding of some type of understanding of like what the science is. And I'm sure like Daniel feels the same way with the theology. So definitely feel free to interrupt throughout the presentation. I think with that, Daniel, feel free to take it off.
Right. Thank you, James. So to begin off this topic, I would like to talk about some context and background to refresh our minds. Who were Adam and Eve, and why are they important for us to talk about? So we're going to start with some of the texts in the Bible that speak about Adam and Eve. The first one is from the creation account in Genesis. So after 6 days of creation, God created humankind. It says that God created humankind in his image. In the likeness of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then later in the Genesis 2, we have a second creation account, which gives a slightly more focused or different version of the events, where it says that God formed the first man out of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." And then shortly after this, God created the first woman, Eve, as a helper for Adam by taking one of his ribs and then forming her. So this is the beginning, and we know, most of us know the story, that Adam and Eve were sadly deceived by the serpent in the garden. Eve, after listening to the serpent, was tempted by the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she took the fruit and ate it, and she gave it to her husband Adam, and she ate it. And so by doing that, they disobeyed the command that God gave them. So therefore God punished them by putting a curse on them, and he exiled them away from the garden, and he closed off the garden forever. And most of us know some version of the story, for those of us who are from a Christian background. So to summarize this account, Adam and Eve were the first human beings. They were initially created in the image of God. They were placed in the Garden of Eden, and they were initially without sin and in fellowship with God, with certain calling and certain commands. However, they disobeyed these commands, they sinned, they were expelled from the garden. Then, as the rest of Genesis and the Bible talks about, they went on to have many descendants who filled the earth. But these descendants include us. So all of us descend from Adam and Eve. This is the traditional belief. We will call this the doctrine of monogenesis. Monogenesis meaning that all of us humans, we originally come from one pair of ancestors. Now, we also inherit from Adam and Eve a legacy of sinfulness, of moral corruption, and a subjection to physical and spiritual suffering and death. But this is the traditional account. Now, having set out this traditional account, some people might ask, well, that's a pretty good story, but why is that really important and key? Isn't Christianity more about Jesus Christ? Why is Adam and Eve really that important of an issue? Well, now we can turn to the New Testament, where we have this passage in Romans 5, which is really key to lots of discussions about Adam. Here, the Apostle Paul says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sin." Here, Paul is clearly referring to the first sin that occurred in the garden. Then he goes on to compare Adam and Christ, talking about the free gift. Here, the free gift refers to the gift of grace through Jesus Christ. He says, "But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many." And then Paul, in another epistle in 1 Corinthians 15, where he is talking about the resurrection of Christ and how important it is, he also says something about Adam. "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive." So we see a contrast here between the death that Adam caused in the garden through his sin, in contrast to the resurrection that Christ accomplished. And later in the same chapter, he compares Adam and Christ even more explicitly. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So Adam and Eve, they're not just a nice story in the Bible. the narrative really frames the situation of humanity, which the gospel speaks to. We can sort of summarize this fundamental human condition in several points. The first point is that we as human beings were originally created good, righteous, and in fellowship with God. That's our intended purpose originally. However, since the fall, everyone is fallen and everyone is in bondage to sin. We are unable to always choose what is good. And so we are all in need of redemption and salvation through the work of Jesus Christ. Without this, we are all separated from God and alienated from him. And this is why the gospel is relevant, not just to certain people who are sinful, but everyone, because everyone is sinful. Now, I want to quickly contrast this traditional view of the human condition to some popular cultural beliefs that you may have come across. For example, there's an idea that perhaps humans are neither good or evil, but we have a free choice to determine whether we want to choose one or the other. We're completely free. And so notice this, the contrast between this belief and the Christian belief, the traditional Christian belief that we are all in bondage to sin and we can't choose the good. We need God's grace to accomplish that. A second popular culture belief is the idea that we are evolving from lower animalistic behavior towards some sort of higher morality. This is common perhaps in scientifically influenced secular accounts of human origins. So the idea is that we were initially less intelligent animals who are mostly driven by instinct, and we are more predisposed towards violence and selfishness and so on. But now that we want to build more complex societies and do more complicated and sophisticated things, we should gradually move away from that. Now, contrast this sort of gradual rise from lower to higher with the Christian view, which is that we were initially created like righteous and moral, but there was like this fall. So there's like this discontinuity that we fall and then we go up. We can only be raised back up through the work of Christ. Okay. So besides this, these reasons that I've talked about the importance of the Adam and Eve narrative, there are other reasons that have been cited. So we talked about the doctrine of monogenesis, meaning the idea, again, that all human beings descend from Adam and Eve. So we come from one source. Now, this, besides talking about the fall and so on, this has also been used to argue for the unity and equality of all human beings. The idea is that no matter what ethnicity, what race, what culture you're from, everyone ultimately came from the same pair of ancestors. So everyone is really one big family, and there is no reason to prefer any specific group over the other. Another reason is that Genesis 1-3, as many of you probably have encountered, this is at the centerpiece of debates about the interpretation, the authority, and the infallibility of the Bible. In many circles, what your stance is on Genesis 1-3, how you interpret that, how you relate that to science and other things, this becomes sort of a litmus test for whether you're classified as an evangelical, a conservative, or a liberal, and so on. So this is quite an important point to discuss. Now, to summarize, in Christianity, the story of Adam and Eve and the fall, it has multiple functions. The first one is an account of human origins, like who we are, our ontology, our identity, and our purpose as humans, what we're originally intended for. The second one is a theodicy. It also explains why we find ourselves in the situation around us. We don't find ourselves in an ideal world. Instead, we observe lots of sin, lots of evil, suffering, all in around us. And that explains that it originally came because we fell. Our first parents fell, and their legacy has been continued to this day. Finally, this story gives us a foundation for soteriology, basically why we are all in need of salvation and why we're all in need of the gospel. Now, having, I hope, convinced you of the importance of the story of Adam and Eve, the question is, how does this story fit with what modern science says about the origin of human beings? So this is the point where I will pass this on to James.
Thanks, Daniel. And so just diving into scientific foundations of human origins, there's a lot to be said here, but I'm only going to give a very brief summary. So when we think about the current scientific foundations of human origins, it's known that humans and chimps are known to have diverged from each other roughly 7 to 10 million years ago. So you have chimpanzees here and you have Homo sapiens here, and they're known to have diverged. Well, in this diagram, you see that it's approximately between 7 to 8 million years ago. And moreover, when you think about the context of human evolution, there have been discoveries in the fossil record, which have shown potentially transitionary species along the way. So when you think about human evolution, when you think about the ancient hominin history, there have been discoveries of Australopithecines, have been discoveries of other members of the Homo genus, which have shown strong evidence of humans evolving from a more a more chimpanzee-like ancestor. And also in human evolution, evolution is known to happen gradually across populations. Humans, in this case, are never known to have come from a distinct pair, solely from a distinct pair of individuals. And this, when you look at face value, appears to contradict a classic genesis interpretation of Adam and Eve, of all of human beings being descended solely from Adam and Eve. And when you look at the genetic data, we know that there hasn't been, before I explain that, it's very important to note that humans and chimpanzees were known to have diverged from each other within the millions range time scale. But when you look at the historical Adam and Eve, what's often been done is, like, when you add the genealogies in Genesis, you can reach a date of Adam and Eve potentially existing roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. So this appears, again, to be in contrast behind human origins as having developed over hundreds of thousands, over millions of years. And so this is kind of like where a big debate is, and where, like, misunderstandings of the scientific evidence appears to, like, pit against, like, okay, Adam and Eve have, like, they've arisen 6,000 years ago, but we know that humans and chimpanzees were known to have diverged over 7 million years ago. And so with that, I think the next slide is you, Daniel.
Yeah, okay. So basically, yeah, I'm just going to recap what James just said. The Genesis narrative, and compared to the modern scientific narrative that James just sort of laid out, it depicts human beings as originating from a single couple, monogenesis. The second one is that it shows a clear distinction between humans and other animals. Humans are made in the image of God and others are not. The third one is that it seems to depict a recent origin of humans, as James said, between 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Now, where does this come from? Well, if you look at the genealogy of Genesis 5 and you count the years, the ages of Adam's descendants that are shown there, even if, say, there are several gaps in those genealogies, you will still end up realistically with something over several thousand years, and not like hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Second one is that Adam and Eve are depicted as farmers. Their descendants, their immediate descendants, they build cities, and they work the land. They're not hunter-gatherers. So this sort of gives you that the idea that if they were historical, then they probably are living in a relatively recent time, at the beginning of civilization, so to speak. Now, in contrast, the scientific picture which we just gone through, it has differences to these 3 points. It posits that there are hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and that there are many different diverse hominid species, not just like one species of Homo sapiens, for example, but there are other members of the Homo genus and other primates related to us, and that there are populations. So not just 2 people, but usually many thousands of individuals at the least that are evolving, interacting with other populations. This has led to the common perception that monogenesis and a recent Adam and other aspects of the traditional biblical account, these are all in conflict with modern science. So to kind of give an example of popular beliefs about this, so this is a quote from evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, who's also a pretty active, like, public atheist. He says that the scientific evidence shows that Adam and Eve could not have existed, at least in the way they're portrayed in the Bible, because genetic data show no evidence of any human bottleneck as small as 2 people. There are simply too many different kinds of genes around for that to be true. And he says these are scientific facts, and that because of this, we can dismiss a physical Adam and Eve with near scientific certainty. Now, even among Christian biologists, Christian scientists, this belief is also pretty common. For example, this is from an article from about 10 years ago in NPR, where it depicts several evangelical Christian scientists who are starting to doubt the existence of Adam and Eve. So Dennis Venema, who's a Christian biologist, he says, he's quoted as saying that the idea that we all descend from Adam and Eve would be against the genomic evidence. So that's not likely at all. So these are just examples of common beliefs about how Adam and Eve relate to modern science. The result of this perceived impasse is that Christians usually take one of 3 ways to respond to this conflict. So first is to reject the idea of a historical Adam, because science simply demands it. So these scholars would typically say that the Adam narrative, it's a theologically important story, but it's more of an illustrative or literary story. It's a myth about our origins. It explains where we come from. It explains the human condition, but it didn't historically ever really happen. And so some of the people who hold to this view are, in fact, some people that you might be familiar with, such as Alistair McGrath, who's also written like a lot of apologetics related stuff against Richard Dawkins, for example. There's this option. So the second option is to reject mainstream science and just believe in a traditional view no matter what. So an extreme example of this would be an organization like Answers in Genesis, which is like a young Earth creationist organization. They would maintain a traditional belief that Adam and Eve lived 6,000 to 10,000 years, and they were indeed the first biological humans, that there were no other animals or hominids that are anywhere like them at the time. And that they also, of course, disagree with the dating of various hominid fossils that have been dated to like thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And also more broadly, they think that the age of the Earth is pretty young. And so that's another extreme option. Now, the third option, which we're going to focus on in the rest of this talk, is that there are people who have attempted to reconcile historical Adam with mainstream science. You might also be familiar with some of these names. For example, John Walton wrote a series of books called The Lost World of Adam and Eve, Lost World of Genesis 1. There's Dennis Alexander, who's also an evangelical theologian who wrote books about Adam and Eve. Reasons to Believe is a Christian ministry that is commonly classified as a so-called old Earth creationist. So they believe in an old Earth, but they have their own theory of Adam and Eve, which they claim is still consistent with mainstream science. And finally, we have, as another example, Joshua Swamidass, who's a bit of a newer voice of the debate. And we're going to focus on his theory, his model, because we think it has some interesting features and raises interesting points these attempts to reconcile a historical Adam with mainstream science. Okay, to start off with, so Joshua Swamidass is someone I know personally. He is a computational biologist, professor at Washington University of St. Louis. So he's a tenured professor with many published papers, someone who understands evolution and so on. But unlike some of the voices that we quoted earlier, this is one of his early quotes and pretty much used quotes. He says that entirely consistent with the genetic and archaeological evidence, it is possible that Adam was created out of the dust and Eve out of his rib less than 10,000 years ago. Leaving the garden their offspring would have blended with those outside it, biologically identical neighbors from the surrounding area. In a few thousand years, they would become genealogical ancestors of everyone. So, this quote is saying a lot, and we're going to unpack it in the rest of this talk. But I think at face value, it seems quite shocking because we have this professor of computational biology who's like doesn't identify as rejecting mainstream science, but yet he claims that you can maintain what looks like a traditional view of Adam and Eve while also maintaining consistency with science. So what does he really mean by this? Most of his views that we're going to talk about, they're developed in this book called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. This book was published by InterVarsity Press in 2019. And so if you're interested to read more in more depth about the things we're going to present, I urge you to buy it and take a look at it. So the key principle, the key hypothesis that he's offering here is that Adam and Eve are indeed the first humans in the theological sense, but they're not necessarily the first Homo sapiens to have ever existed. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that we've been talking a lot about, humans, the first human, all human beings, and so on and so forth. What do we really mean by the word human? When we're talking about science, we often assume that human is referring to like anatomically modern humans, so maybe what scientists call like Homo sapiens. However, even within the scientific community, there's often a lot of debate over what constitutes Homo sapiens, like what kind of development, intellectual development, like tool making development, and so on, does a species or a sample finding have to exhibit before they can be categorized as modern humans. So given like even these disagreements, these debates in the scientific community about what constitutes humans, when we move that over to what is human in theology, what is human in scripture, then I think we have to be even more careful. We can't just assume that what scientists think is human is what theologians and Christians have thought is human for many hundreds and even thousands of years of theological debate and discussion. So we have to carefully define these terms. Now, what Swamidass's view amount to is claiming that there could be other non-theological humans outside the garden besides Adam and Eve. Now, this might seem perhaps like a crazy idea, an outlandish idea, compared to the traditional idea. However, some people often forget is that they forget that there are hints of people other than Adam and Eve in Scripture. So to give some examples, in Genesis 4, after the story of Adam and Eve, we are given the story of their two sons, Abel and Cain murders his brother Abel. And afterwards, God banishes Cain away from where they were living, and he's going to be given a certain brand, a sign that marks him as a murderer. And Cain is afraid that somebody will kill him for that. And the question is, why would he be afraid of anyone killing him if at the moment there was only like 3 other people? The second one is later, it's described that Cain afterwards, he had a wife, and he also went on to build a city. So where did his wife come from? And how did he build a city? Did they just build a city with 2 people and maybe some children? How does that make sense? And finally, another piece of evidence is in Genesis 6, where it talks about the Nephilim, these described as the sons of God who intermarry with the daughters of man, and this arouses God's displeasure. And Nephilim, it's unclear who they were. There's lots of debate over who they were. So of course, these 3 examples, there's been a lot of debate in Christian tradition about them, and there are traditional theological answers to these questions. But however, I do feel that perhaps some of these answers are only really convincing if you've already assumed the conclusion that there could never be other human-like individuals other than Adam and Eve. So, for example, the idea that Cain's wife must have been his sister. Okay, so going on, in the model that is proposed by Joshua Swamidass, Adam and Eve are indeed the ancestors of all of us. So this is, again, the doctrine of monogenesis, but they're genealogical ancestors, and this differs from genetic ancestors of genetic ancestry. And James will shortly explain the science of what this really means. And because they're the genealogical ancestors of all of us, we can actually maintain belief in both monogenesis and recent historical Adam and Eve in a way that does not actually conflict with any findings of modern science.
Okay, is this my slide? Let's see.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
so.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to take over at this point and really go into the weeds of the genealogical model that's proposed by Joshua Swamidass. And again, I want to put out the big question out here. Like what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is asking the overall question, is it scientifically possible for Adam and Eve to have arisen in a biblically consistent time frame between 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, and for them also to be ancestors of everyone alive today? And spoiler alert, the short answer is yes, but we will need to build some logic and have some assumptions in making that claim. And so one, there's the assumption that Adam and Eve's descendants mixed and like had descendants with people outside the garden that Daniel alluded to earlier. So in this specific model, Adam and Eve, they're maybe the first theologically important humans, but there were also other Homo sapiens outside the garden that Adam and Eve's descendants interacted with. And this is a very crucial point that allows them to be the ancestors of everyone potentially today in a scientifically consistent time frame. And the second thing that I want to emphasize is that in this model, Adam and Eve can be the genealogical ancestors of everyone today, but not necessarily the genetic of ancestors of everyone today. And so this whole like genealogical versus genetic ancestry, like what is that? I'm gonna unpack that and hopefully it'll make more sense to you as I go through the presentation. So first of all, when we mention genealogical ancestry, this is ancestry in the normal sense that like people understand it. This diagram that you see here is a genealogy, and squares that you see here are male, and circles that you see here are female, and the line that connects the bottom row with the top one are the descendants that these individuals leave behind. So for example, Jeff had kids with Dorothy, and they had Susan and John, and then John had kids with Judy, and they had three daughters as well. So this is just genealogy that you understand in the classic sense. And when you think about this genealogy, I also want to bring in another definition to help us understand common ancestry. So in this talk, in these remaining slides, when I talk about universal common ancestors, those are ancestors of everyone existing at present day or to everyone after a certain time point in history. So what are common ancestors? What are universal common ancestors? So here again is a genealogy that I just made from scratch. Say that we're looking only at the individuals here that's colored in orange. So the ancestors of these two individuals, they can be these green individuals here, because you see that actually this is a small typo. It can only be this green female here, because this female is linked to the genealogy of the male orange individual here and the female orange individual here. And they can also be, ancestors can also consist of these two individuals here, because if you trace the genealogy's paths back, you can reach this male and this female for these two individuals. So when I have an orange for required descendants, I mean we look at a subset of descendants that we're interested in, and we're trying to see, okay, like who are like the common ancestors of these two descendants. And so when I say universal common ancestor, I mean the ancestors of everyone like at this level. And so again, I mentioned that this is a typo. Like this male individual here would not be the ancestor of this female here. So this is why this is a typo. And this male individual here will not be the ancestor of this individual here. But this female individual here is the ancestor of both these individuals. Hopefully that makes sense. And if not, I can clarify more. But these individuals, this female individual here is the most recent universal common ancestor of these two individuals on the bottom. And when we look at, say like we're interested in not just the two individuals at the very bottom, but say we're interested in the individuals in the bottom two levels, then the question is, okay, like what are the common ancestors of all of these orange individuals? And that again is from arises from the green descendants here. And so actually this is like another typo. This is so sorry, this is like my fault. These two males do not descend from this couple. But hopefully like this illustration just shows you like what I mean by common ancestors and what I mean by what I mean by the required descendants of these ancestors these ancestors.
Hey James, sorry for interrupt.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Go for it. Yeah.
So is the idea basically like you might not be the direct ancestor of someone, but as long as you have kids and your kids mixed with other folks and they get married and they have other kids, and somehow you kind of mix yourself into the population, your genealogy. Is that it? Is that the idea?
The idea with ancestry is you like when you draw out the say like you had like a perfect knowledge of like the entire genealogy of the human species or like the entire genealogy of a group of individuals. The idea is that can you find individuals which like for a certain level of individuals, can you trace their ancestry back to specific individuals in the past? And in this case, for these two orange individuals here, you can trace it to these green individuals in the past at this level. And so I'm going to keep unpacking this as I go further on. But does that kind of make sense, Fred? Like when we're talking about common ancestors, we're like looking at genealogies in this sense.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So in this case, like these two individuals on this side, like they wouldn't be common ancestors of both of these individuals here, right? Because like you can't trace going back in time. You can't trace an ancestry path from this male individual to these individuals here. Okay, and so going further on, so when we talk about genealogical versus genetic ancestry, I just mentioned what genealogical ancestry is in the previous slide, and these are confusing terms that really require clarification, because if you just Google like Eve, like genetic ancestry Eve, what you often see popping up is like these news articles about that happened roughly like a decade or two, like more so like over 2 decades ago, but like a decade or two ago. And these news articles talk about like, oh, there's this idea of a mitochondrial Eve, and this is the mother of all humans that lived 200,000 years ago. And there's also the Y chromosomal Adam that lived 200,000 years ago as well. And then like you have like articles that basically talk about the idea of there's like this individual female and like there's this individual male that are the descendants of everyone alive today, but like their ancestry is like 100 to 200,000 years ago. And so this again appears to conflict with the recent dates of Adam and Eve being alive like 6 to 10,000 years ago. So when you think about genetic ancestry is really focused on tracing the ancestry of individual pieces of DNA. And I'm going to do an illustration tracing the genetic ancestry of the mitochondrial chromosome, but this is a very important point. Whereas genealogy is tracing the ancestry of genealogical ancestry is tracing the ancestry of individuals based off genealogy. Genetic ancestry looks at pieces of DNA, and there's a distinction there that I'll make clear in the next slide. And so the question I have is, like, does the idea of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam existing 100,000 to 200,000 years ago contradict the idea of a potential human couple, i.e. Adam and Eve being recent ancestors of all humans today? And no, because we need to look specifically towards genealogical ancestry. And the thing to know about genetic ancestry is that it is a subset of universal genealogical ancestors. And so in science, when we talk about genetic ancestors, they are a subset of universal genealogical ancestry. And so our universal genetic ancestors may be hundreds of thousands of years in the past, but universal genealogical ancestors can actually arise more recently. And why is that the case? Well, we'll look at one specific example here. So universal genealogical ancestors can appear much more quickly in the past than genetic ancestors. And the intuition is that genetic ancestry limits the paths that can be traced back along genealogies to find common ancestry. So what do I mean by that? So we're going to use the example of mitochondrial DNA. So in mitochondrial DNA, this is DNA that is only passed by the maternal lineage. And we're going to use that to trace. So this is the example of a genealogy that I had before. And we're going to use it to see the trace ancestry, to look at ancestry if we were only to trace back ancestry along the maternal path. So when we do that, one example ancestry that can be potentially traced back is this female here. And so notice in this case, because we're looking at mitochondrial DNA, and mitochondrial DNA can only be passed down from humans, when we try to find a female individual, which is the genetic ancestors of everyone of these two individuals here, when we go back and trace the ancestral path, we can only walk where there's a female in the past. So notice how in this case, like I might have a male individual here and a female individual here, but then when I try to find ancestors, I can only go through female individuals, because for mitochondrial DNA, it's again only passed down through females. So in this case, the most recent universal common ancestor would arise here. However, in genealogical ancestry, we can trace back between both maternal and paternal paths. And so this essentially opens up the range of paths that can be traced. And so instead of only allowing to go through females in the past, we can go through both females and males. And this allows us to trace the most recent common ancestor to this female individual here. And so this is a much more recent date than ancestry based off mitochondrial DNA, which allows us to infer an ancestor at a later time point. So these are toy examples just to illustrate the idea that genealogical ancestors, because they can trace back lineages in both males and females, are allowed to find ancestors at a much more recent date than if we were only allowed to trace ancestors through certain pieces of DNA. And I'm using mitochondrial DNA as an example here. So does anyone so Brian, you have a question, go for it.
Yeah, I thought this is because I study this area a little bit myself, so I thought I would just offer a clarification kind of for Fred. So yeah. How another way to say genealogical ancestor would just be someone who is your great grandparent with some number of greats. That is your genealogical ancestor. So a common genealogical ancestor would be someone who is a great grandparent of everyone alive today. So that I think that's another correct way to say genealogical ancestor.
Yeah, genealogical ancestor is ancestry that you just know in a canonical sense, like what Brian said, your great grandparent. But genetic ancestry is different because it requires tracing specific pieces of DNA. And so again, like in this example, we're tracing the mitochondrial DNA here. And because that DNA is only passed by certain individuals, we're restricted in the paths that we can take to go back to find ancestors in the past.
Sorry, but in that example, wouldn't your great grandfather also share a similar piece of genetic code with you that you can trace back, or it doesn't work like that?
In this example, you're talking about this male individual here?
Yeah, like what Brian was just saying. Sorry, I'm out of my kid's soccer game, so I wasn't looking at the screen, so I was just trying to understand this in my head. So,
okay.
So basically, like, what I was understanding that genealogically, there's still a genetic connection, right, between your genealogical ancestor with you. It's just that it's different versus genetic, because it sounds like for genetic, you're just tracing this one specific piece of gene that may or may not.
Yeah, you're tracing specific pieces of DNA. I don't have an example of like tracing like the Y chromosome, but essentially when people talk about genetic ancestry, like in the news articles that I have in the, if I were to go back in the past, these are all focused on specific pieces of DNA. Whereas genealogical ancestry, I think maybe the best way you can understand it is that like it encompasses these genetic ancestors, and it's not restricted just based off specific pieces of DNA. Brian, do you want to jump in on that point, since like you do work in that field? Do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example. Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, so in this example where James is just looking at the mitochondrial DNA, if you go up 4 generations, like here, there's the person in pink, right? If you assume like, if you go up 4 generations, usually you have 16 like great-great-grandparents. But in the mitochondrial example, of those 16 genealogical ancestors, only 1 is the genetic ancestor for the mitochondrion, because you need to always go up through like mother's mother. So you only get not all of the genealogical ancestors are genetic ancestors. And that's like the idea of the Venn diagram. And
okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I were to...
Hey, James, can't you even go further and say that you have genealogic ancestors from whom you have no DNA?
Yes, that's a key point. I didn't want to bring up that idea to confuse people for Iran, but yes, within what Finney mentioned, like when you look at specific pieces of DNA, like you definitely have people in the past who don't contribute any genetic DNA to like the descendants that arise today, but they are your genealogical ancestors. So in this case, like this male individual like wouldn't contribute any mitochondrial DNA, like when we're only looking at mitochondrial DNA, but this male individual is still like the genealogical ancestors of these 2 individuals. So I think hopefully like the next few slides will help clarify some points. I also recognize that we're running short on time, and we do have a fair amount of additional slides, so I'm going to go through this a bit quickly, but hopefully that will like clarify more. And so there's actually this famous paper by this person named Joseph Chang in 1999, who you can actually do simulations to show that genealogical ancestors appear much more quickly in the past than genetic ancestors. So in this example simulation, you can like let n be the number of individuals in a population. Genetic ancestors appear on a scale of n generations. Genealogical ancestors appear on a scale of log n generations. And so for a concrete example, say like we have 1 million people and we're trying to find ancestors in these 1 million people. It's found in these simulations that universal genetic ancestors can arise in 2 million generations, which is an exceedingly great amount of generations. But universal genealogical ancestors, in contrast, can arise in 20 generations. So these genealogical ancestors can appear much more quickly. And when another factor influencing the timing of universal common ancestry is really the extensive sharing of ancient family history due to common ancestors. This leads to the collapse of genealogies. So what I mean by that is when you think about individuals existing and when you just have like a very naive example of genealogy. So for example, say we have 18 million people living today. Assume that 5,000 years ago, like there were 18 million people that lived. And if you assume that there's 30 years between each generation and there's no overlap in family trees, then 10,000 years ago, there would be 2.6 times 10 to the 55 ancestors that lived. That's more than the number of stars in the universe. And so like, how is that possible? Like you can't just like keep going back and assume that there's no overlap in family trees. But how to reconcile this is that like we know that ancient family trees in the past are not distinct, like they combine and they mix. So this is like a very toy example to illustrate what I mean. So assume you have these three individuals. If you assume that each of these three individuals' genealogies are completely independent, then in the past we have 12 ancestors. But if they share ancestors, then these genealogies like collapse and combine together. And so instead of 12 in this example, like you have 10 here, if they share descendants. And we know in the past that human populations in the ancient past, the population size has actually remained relatively constant. So this means that like we don't have exponential increase of ancestors in the past. Like we do have mixing of genealogies, which like makes the finding of recent common ancestors appear much more quickly. And so summary of factors leading to really recent universal common ancestors. So when we think about genealogical ancestry, that allows us to trace more paths in a human genealogy to find universal common ancestors compared with only thinking about genetic ancestry. And our ancestors, they also do not increase exponentially in the past. Genealogies frequently collapse through the shared ancestors. This further allows finding of universal common ancestors to arise more recently. These two factors really allow us to have a much more recent date of a potential historical Adam and Eve. So not going too much into the weeds of it, but taking these two ideas and doing simulations, it's actually possible that like say you want Adam and Eve to be the required descendants of everyone from AD 1 to present day 2000s, then it's possible when you look at genealogical ancestry that Adam and Eve can potentially be the genealogical ancestors of everyone 6,000 years ago. So this diagram here is also an example of a simulation that Joshua did himself, where say you want the required descendants to be this block here, then if you look back into the past, you can actually find a universal genealogical ancestor of everyone in the past with roughly 3,000 years ago in the 5,000 year time range. But if you keep going back, you'll have more and more of these universal genealogical ancestors, because the ancestor of like an individual who's an ancestor of everyone here is wait, let me explain that again. So if we do have a pair of individuals which is the ancestors of everyone here, then the ancestors of them would also be the ancestors of the required descendants here. And so as you go further and further back, we reach a point called the IAP, which is the identical ancestor point. And everyone past that point is either the ancestors of all required descendants here or the ancestors of no one. So these universal genealogical ancestors, colored in black, they quickly fill up, and you would have like tons of them if you go back 6,000 years ago, greater than 6,000 years ago. And even if you want the required descendants to be present day to 6,000 years ago, you would still find universal genealogical ancestors arising really quickly within the 9,000 to 11,000 year time range. And so overall summary is, for this part, is that it's possible for Adam and Eve to be created, quote unquote, out of the dust 6,000 to 10,000 years ago and be placed in the Garden of Eden sometime in the Middle East. But this also has to be accompanied with the idea that there were other biological human beings existing before them, and those are people outside the garden. And these biological humans existing outside the garden, they have to have mixed with the descendants of Adam and Eve. And they were, again, like Adam and Eve were initially sinless and immortal, commissioned to expand the garden across the earth, but they fell and were exiled of the garden and became subject to physical and spiritual death, as Dainel mentioned before. And again, these descendants were interbred with people outside the garden. And within a few thousand years, it's entirely possible through just pure simulations, modeling population history, that all human beings can trace their genealogical ancestry to Adam and Eve. And I think the next slide is yours, Dainel. So just a warning for everyone that yeah, I'm gonna let you Dainel take over now. That we still have a few slides to go, so we're probably gonna go like maybe 20 minutes over. If anybody needs to leave, like that's perfectly fine. But there are still like other aspects of the model that like we would want to go into, and Dainel is gonna describe that.
Right. So I might go through this a bit quickly since we don't have much time, but these are some details of the model. And just to be clear, these details are, even if you talk with Swamidass himself, these are quite tentative details and quite speculative, and he's open to revise them if there's good theological or scientific reasons to do so, but mostly theological reasons. But this gives us maybe a clue towards understanding how the model can fit with other things, other features of the Bible and theology that we're concerned with. So, as we talked about in the very beginning, there's these two creation accounts in Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation, and a creation account in Genesis 2, which describes the creation of humans more specifically. Now, in the model, it could be that Genesis 1 and 2 are both historically accurate, like in terms of they really describe historical events regarding the creation of humans, but they simply have different scope. So in Genesis 1, the 6th day of creation in verse 26-28, this describes the creation of biological humans made in the image of God, who are capable of rational thinking and other human-like behaviors. These humans may have aroused via providentially determined and controlled evolutionary processes, perhaps. And these are people, this include people who are outside the garden, so besides Adam and Eve. But then in Genesis 2, you have a more specific account that describes two specific individuals, Adam and Eve, who are created miraculously, meaning de novo, from not without previous ancestors, and they're created and placed in the Garden of Eden. And in this telling, Adam and Eve, they were initially commissioned to be special representatives of God with the task to expand the garden across the earth. They're created de novo, meaning without ancestors, and that signifies their special status, their special origin. They're not just picked out from the previous population of biological human beings. They're initially righteous, sinless, they have fellowship with God, and they have access to the tree of life in the garden, so they're immortal. They're not subject to physical death, and they're also in spiritual fellowship with God. However, they're biologically similar to people outside the garden. So if a scientist were to look at them and examine them, they would just be classified as a Homo sapiens. And that's a feature of this model, because in this telling, Adam and Eve were commissioned not to make their own little community separate from everybody else, but to basically interact with people outside the garden, sort of like to minister to them, to bring a message to them. And in this sense, the special calling of Adam and Eve would be similar to what we see in the rest of Genesis, where God calls people like Abraham or Moses for a special purpose. Neither Abraham nor Moses are smarter or stronger or faster than anybody else. They're biologically the same type of people as their contemporaries, but the difference is that they are theologically significant, and because of that, they're historically significant. They're given a special purpose, a special calling. And so we would think that Adam is biologically not different, structurally speaking, from other human beings, but he could have had a special calling that God commissioned him to be. However, as we've talked about, they fail in this calling. So there's a fall. And what does the fall mean in this model? Well, a fall would have multiple aspects in this model. So first, after the fall, as we read in the story, access to the Garden of Eden was permanently cut off. No one can enter the garden anymore. We don't know where it is. And the possibility of obtaining immortality and fellowship with God was severed from the world as well. The second aspect of the fall is that Adam and Eve would have many descendants, and including everyone in this room. And Adam and Eve, even though they disobeyed God, they were not immediately physically killed by God. Instead, they were spared, and they were allowed to continue their life outside the garden. And so there's like this so-called debt between us and God, a debt of mercy. And this debt is not just something that Adam and Eve owe to God, but also each of us who are connected to Adam and Eve because we're descended from them. If my father was never born, then I would not exist. Same with my mother, and same with my grandparents, right, or my great-grandparents. If any one of my ancestors were not born, I would not exist right now. So similarly, we go all the way back. If Adam and Eve were killed after they sinned, we would not exist. So because of that, each of us also partake in this debt of mercy because we're descended from Adam and Eve, and this is a debt of that is never paid back until the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. So that's another way in which what the fall means, and you can possibly connect this to ideas of original sin, for example, that the idea that we inherit physical and moral corruption and guilt from Adam due to our descent from him. We could sort of reclaim a sort of traditional view of this. Now, the third aspect of the fall is that this is a perhaps more speculative idea that the fall may have been correlated with increases in larger scale violence, warfare, slavery, as Adam and Eve and their descendants are depicted as building large cities and civilizations. There's the story of the flood, right, and Tower of Babel. So it could be that the fall is correlated with increases in sin across the world. Now taking a step back, now that we've kind of laid out the basics of the model, I want to talk about what are its strengths. So the first thing is that the model allows us to affirm key components of the so-called traditional view of Adam and Eve. The first one is monogenesis, the idea that we all descend from a single pair. This allows for historical fall and original sin, as we've just described. The idea that we inherit like some legacy of sin from them. The second one is that it allows for a recent date of Adam and Eve within the 10,000 years. Now, what would this mean? Why would we care about this? Well, the first thing is that this would mean that the agrarian, the farming setting of Genesis 1-11 would actually be historically accurate and realistic. And the second one is that this would also make sense why that we have the account from Genesis 1-11. When we talk about, say, how we got the accounts of Jesus and his life and his ministry, we talk about how they were these accounts were orally passed down for oral tradition, and then they would record it and transmit it. So if Adam and Eve lived within 10,000 years, so not that far long ago, then it's more plausible that a similar account could have been transmitted all the way from Adam through their descendants and to someone like Moses, who would write down these accounts and give us the book of Genesis. Finally, besides the key components of the traditional view, we also, as James has explained, this will be consistent with the modern scientific account of human origins. However, despite these strengths of the model, which seems to give you everything or close to everything you want, I would also like to highlight that there are still many unexplored questions and potential theological issues. And we certainly don't want to present this model as sort of a silver bullet that solves everything. And I'll go through this hopefully quickly. So some unexplored questions. For example, we suggested that there are people outside the garden who are not descended from Adam and Eve, even though they no longer live among us today, because by now everyone is descended from Adam and Eve. But we claim that they could have been made in the image of God as well. But would this, for example, compromise the notion of Adam as the first man? In theology, it's very important that the idea of human in theology is often tied with the image of God. And so it would seem quite to create problems. And this is related to the different understandings of what the image of God means. It could refer to our physical makeup as human being, or what we do, our function, and so on. I will not get into this debate, but basically this is quite a complex topic. Some other questions include, why did these people outside the garden, did they have access to fellowship with God and eternal life, especially after Adam and Eve fell and the access to the garden was cut off? Did they still have this chance to have fellowship with God? And another perhaps more troubling question is if there were biological humans who were around and they were intelligent and able to have a will like us, and they could have committed acts of violence, right? Which is quite common among in evolutionary history. Would this count as a sin before the fall of Adam and Eve? And another one is they were presumably subject to physical death. How would we reconcile that with the original goodness of creation? That God said that after creation that everything was very good, and that death is considered to be an alien intrusion into creation. Would this create a problem? And finally, is the new account of the fall that I just talked about on the previous slide, is it sufficient to maintain a traditional view of original sin? Besides, there are some additional questions which I will just go quickly. But for example, there are many other things which we haven't talked about, like what the flood and the Tower of Babel. Do we have? If we want to think these are also historically accurate in some sense, then what does that mean? Christology. So, for example, when we talk about any model of the fall of original sin, we have to also preserve the true humanity of Jesus Christ, but also that he wasn't affected by sin and brokenness. We have to be able to say that, and it's unclear whether this model would allow us to do that. There's issue of the question of the atonement. For example, did Christ die for people who were not descended from Adam and Eve, even if they're just like us in terms of rational and intellectual, physical abilities? And I do not want to go into these issues in very great detail, but rather to just illustrate that whatever you believe about Adam and Eve, whether it's this model or another model, there are lots of systematic implications of such a theological model. And it's not really just about whether the question of how we interpret Genesis 1 to 3, because these other systematic implications affect how you interpret other passages in the Bible about atonement, Christology, and so on. So let's go on to conclusion. The question of the historical Adam and Eve and the fall will continue to fascinate many Christians because they're deep textual, theological, and they're also philosophical reasons, which basically are revolving around all this question of who we are as human beings and what we're made for. And there are multiple models of Adam and Eve which have been proposed. And today we showed you one of them, which is the one by Joshua Swamidass, but there are other models that we didn't get into today, which have various ideas about, for example, some that think that Adam and Eve were very, very ancient individuals, like existing like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they all tried to reconcile both scientific and theological concerns. However, regardless of whether you completely agree with it or not, the work of Swamidass, I think, raises really interesting theological questions. And it proposes this innovative path to reconciling a recent Adam and Eve with modern Genesis and modern science. However, much work remains to be done to analyze this model as well as others. So finally, for further reading, there are some works here that we could recommend. So for example, Joshua Swamidass, the book that most of what we talk about came from is called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, which was published by IVP. And he also has a website where he has many articles explaining the model in less words. William Lane Craig released a very recent book about the historical Adam, which has a slightly different model, but also in consultation with Swamidass, and also some other books that I recommend for this topic. So with that ends this portion of the talk, but James and I are around to answer any more questions if you're interested. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Dainel. Again, like we're open to any questions. One thing that I want to reiterate is that like Dainel, do you mind going back to the slide with the quotes that you had from Jerry Coyne?
Jerry Coyne, yeah.
Yeah, and so this whole like genealogical versus genetic ancestry point, if it is confusing to you, like that's okay. Like hopefully, like I tried to like explain it better to a certain extent now, but this is something that's like has like even like evolutionary biologists, like people who like study, who have like some familiarity with it, like they completely miss like the genealogical understanding of Adam and Eve. And so this is where like Swamidass's contribution really is key to all of this, from a sense of he's able to like take a step back and look at genealogical ancestry instead of focusing just on genetic ancestry. So these two quotes here, both Dennis Venema and Jerry Coyne, they specifically look at evidence when you only consider genetic ancestry. But again, like when you bring in genealogical ancestry, it really like changes the perspective of this field of debate. So I just want to reiterate that. Any questions, thoughts?
I have a question about how, is there like a particular way in which Swamidass's model is classified? Like, is it classified as kind of like, not I guess, is it theistic evolution? Or, I mean, how is it different from that? Is there, I don't know, a term used to kind of describe which theological bucket it falls in?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. It's also very like a question with lots of baggage. So yeah. if you ask like Joshua Swamidass, like, you know, before he wrote about this model, he would probably be classified as a theistic evolutionist or evolutionary creationist, you know, because he believed in evolution and the common ancestry of humans and primates and all living things. So he could be classified in that sense. But since he presented this model, he has sort of publicly, at least, really tried to distance himself from that label of theistic evolutionist, because that label often means a lot of things. It usually, it often means, I guess, people like Dennis Venema, for example, who tend to be Christian and they're evangelical even, but they don't think that Adam and Eve were historical individuals, or even if they were not universal ancestors. So, so I would say that like this is, I think Swamidass's model is quite a new kind of thing. He really tries to. It's sort of like a hybrid. You might say a hybrid between some forms of like old Earth creationism and theistic evolution, but really it's more of like a framework, a way of thinking about some of these issues, and I think that's the best way to approach it, like rather than just trying to label and classify it. Yeah.
Okay. That also made me think of another kind of related question. I think everything we talked about today was based on kind of like a new world, or like a young Earth kind of perspective. So how is there no model for like an old world perspective?
You mean in
terms of like the age of the Earth? So everything we talked about today was like assuming the Earth is like 6,000, or I guess, does this model not, does it not matter the age of the Earth with this model, or?
Yeah, that's a very good observation. So I would say that this model, right, like, does not assume a young age of the Earth. Although you could assume that, of course, it would be consistent with that. But it doesn't really talk about that. So for example, to go back to this slide where we talk about the details of the model, this is like when we talk about like two creations of human, like the creation of biological humans and the creation of Adam and Eve. So you can, for example, completely believe that the Earth is billions of years old, as you know, science describes it, and that humans actually did arise, like biological humans did arise via a process of evolution over hundreds of thousands of years, and that happened with God's providence, and that's sort of like a theistic evolutionist kind of view, right? But you could also believe that in addition to that, sometime like in the last 10,000 years, God did a special intervention where he created two special individuals called Adam and Eve in the garden. So that's why like this model is a very flexible model. You might say it's more like a framework, a family of models that the idea here is that like Adam and Eve just whoever they were and whenever they lived, they could have interbred with other humans, other people living outside the garden, and it leads to this whole genealogical ancestry issue that we talked about.
but they themselves would have become what was called the common universal ancestor in the time frame like 6,000 years ago.
Yeah. So basically what James was talking about, like, I guess in this slide, right, is that like when you just talk about genealogical ancestry, you only need a few thousand years, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years before someone who has grandchildren or children, like sufficient number of children, will quickly become the ancestor of everyone living at the time. So within perhaps a few thousand years of their creation, Adam and Eve would become the genealogical ancestors of everyone living on Earth. And so we don't need to worry of the problem, for example, are there people out there in the world right now who are not descended from Adam and Eve? We don't need to worry about that because those people no longer lived since several thousand years ago. So, yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to reiterate Daniel's point a bit, this model makes no assumptions on the age of the Earth. Okay. It's not, I mean, I personally am not, I don't believe in a young Earth. Like, I believe the Earth was like billions of years old. I want to just like be very clear that it's not saying anything about the age of the Earth. It's solely concerned about the ancestry of humans.
Yeah, I think I just got confused about the timeline because that sounds about the timeline of the right advocates as well. So thank you for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in this model, don't you still have to assume like your descendants traveled to different geographic areas to be really mixed with the people over there, right? I mean, don't we have archaeological evidence that the Native Americans or like people in like in the Hawaiian Islands, like they've been there like much longer, right? And that's assuming over the course of like 10,000 years, the descendants of Adam and Eve have traveled to all those places.
Yes, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, Fred. So Joshua actually talks about that in his book extensively. Like, there is definitely like the idea of like, what if like you have like a certain population that's been completely isolated for like 6 to 10,000 years, like they wouldn't be like descended from Adam and Eve, right? But when you actually look at the evidence and when you look at these simulations, you only need, essentially, say you have an isolated population, you only need like one migration of like one or a few individuals from another population into that isolated population for people even in the isolated population to eventually be connected to be connected to a common ancestor with the surrounding global population. So you only need a few migrations of a few people for everyone to be connected. When you look at the actual evidence, like Joshua goes into like potential scenarios of isolate, for example, the Tasmanians of potentially being like isolated like thousands of years. But scientifically, like we can't ever rule out the possibility of single migrants from specific population groups going into other isolated populations and mixing with the population there. Because if that happens, then like you still have universal genealogical ancestors that arise really recently. And in contrast, time and time again, when you look at these ancient DNA studies, what's actually been shown is that there's actually been a lot of mixing in the historical past in contrast to what people think about. So it's easy to consider like two populations as being very isolated. But when you look at the genetic evidence, there's traces of mixing going on all the time, even in purported isolated populations. And one book that I would recommend for people interested in ancient DNA specifically and the idea of ancient populations mixing with each other is there's a book that's not at the end of that Daniel didn't mention. It's by David Reich, who's a professor of genetics here at Harvard, and he wrote this book which specifically talks about ancient DNA and the ways that it has explained mixing that has occurred in the historical ancient past in human history.
So just to confirm, for this model to work, it sounds like at least some descendants of Adam and Eve would have traveled. If you assume, they came about 10,000 years ago. Within this 10,000 years, they would have traveled to these different regions of Earth and intermixed. But you don't need a large.
You don't need a large. Yeah,
okay.
That's correct. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Fred. You don't need like a large migration. You only need a few individuals to travel from one region to another, and to have mixed with people in that region for this model to hold.
And to somewhat add to that, this is explained more fully in the book by Swamidass, but there actually is this very famous paper from Nature 2004 by Roda and Chang and one other author, and they actually did a computer simulation of what would happen as assuming a certain amount of migration within the lifetime of an individual, based on certain reasonable assumptions, how fast would genealogical ancestry spread to all over the world. And in that paper, they actually theorized that the most recent universal common ancestor of everybody living today is living quite recent, only a few thousand years ago. And that sort of was the paper that is heavily cited in Swamidass's work and makes this model quite reasonable, that we know from evidence that humans migrate quite a lot within their lifetimes, and they don't need to migrate. We don't need large-scale migration to the in order to make everyone genealogically related very fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and also it's not like the descendants of Adam has to travel from the Middle East all the way to Tasmania. It's just that their descendants have to travel further out, and their descendants eventually will get
progressively.
That makes much more sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is a big question that Swamidass has in his book, that we can't rule out, scientific evidence can't ever rule out that there were no migrations that happened in which a migration from one group went into an isolated population in another group. But it also can't rule out the fact that maybe there actually are these human populations which have been completely isolated for 10,000 years, but we don't, and he brings that up. So if that is the case, then those individuals would not be direct descendants from Adam and Eve, and there is a larger theological question of even if most of modern humans share a universal genealogical ancestor with Adam and Eve, if you have certain individuals that deviate from that is something that we have to address. But I think overall a few individuals would not destroy his overall argument that he's laying out here. Daniel, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, that would just kind of go back to the question, right, of people outside the garden, meaning people are not descended from Adam and Eve, who they are and what their theological status is. And you might also this would also be related, right, to the hypothetical question that is often raised, what if we find extraterrestrials who are intelligent and they're capable of understanding us, they're just like us, maybe except physically, what would their theological status be? And this might seem like a very hypothetical, crazy question, but it is, I think, actually more of a thought experiment, right? What is the relationship between theological status and your physical makeup, your intellectual makeup? What really makes this human? That's why I think there are these very rich, very deep discussions that are to be had about similar questions. Yeah, these questions.
Yeah.
So basically, as a Christian, if you wouldn't be bothered by the existence of aliens, you shouldn't need to be bothered by the existence of people outside the garden.
I think there still is a distinction, Daniel, because if you believe that Genesis 1 is talking about the creation account of not just Adam and Eve, but including people outside the garden, then they have the imago Dei. They're created in the image of God. But you can't extend that to aliens, I guess.
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of thorny issues there too. Yeah, so.
Okay, sure.
But that's a valid point for sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, James. Thanks so much for doing this presentation. Good to see you, Daniel, by the way.
Oh yeah, you too. Right.
I'm just wondering, with the open questions, has James, or do you have any thoughts on, I'm sorry, Josh, or do you have any thoughts on how to reconcile like that sinful question? Like, when did people become sinful or accountable for sin? And then when did people become people? Assuming if you assume an evolutionary backdrop, like when did, okay, like now a person is a person with an eternal soul, and now they're accountable for sin.
Yeah, Dainel, you want to jump in? This is
So that's indeed like a bit of a thorny question, but like in Swamidass's model, right? Like the clearest idea is that if we're just talking about the descendants of Adam and Eve, then it's clear that once they disobeyed the commandment of God in the garden, and we are all connected to their disobedience. Like they transgressed an explicit command of God, and so they became sinful. And it makes sense that we are all we partake in an inheritance of guilt, an inheritance of like moral corruption. We continue in those sinful ways personally as well. And so I think there's a clear-cut answer that we're there, like that since the fall we are definitely transgressing against God. But of course, like there's a more broader question, right? Like how about the people after the garden? When did they become sinful? And I think that is,
or even outside of the garden.
Yeah, outside the garden. When did they become sinful?
Like right. The people even before, taking this model, the people before Adam and Eve, then
right,
were they sinful?
Right, and I think that's really a question that I am still like studying, and I think it is like a potential sort of you might say it's a potential objection or a weak point in the model, right? Like I think what Swamidass would say is that the people outside the garden they might have committed some sort of sin in a sense, but they were not committing like a transgression, like a transgression of an explicit command, and so their sin was different. And I think Swamidass would go on to quote Romans 5 verses 12 to 14, that without law the transgression is not counted, and so on and so forth. And this gets into thorny interpretation of that passage. So I think it is a very important question, I think, but I think there is some clear biblical evidence that sins are counted differently when we're talking about like transgressing an explicit command versus transgressing a more implicit one, like a moral law, like a more general law that you might not be aware of. So those are both, to be sure, counted as sin, but they're counted as sin in different ways. Yeah.
And there is, I would just add a quote I'm looking at here from Dennis Alexander's Creation or Evolution.
Yeah.
I know it's a little bit different, but it talks about that lightly. It says essentially that it's not Swamidass is thinking, but this is talking about how Homo divinus marked the time at which God chose to reveal himself and his purposes for humankind for the first time. So Adam is essentially viewed as the federal head of the whole humanity alive at that time. So this seems to me to be saying essentially, similar to what David was just saying, is that perhaps there was a general sin, but God hadn't given a command yet to be transgressed, kind of like along that same lines. And he calls this, Adam being Homo divinus. I don't know if that's the same or if it's more confusing or less confusing, David, but it sounded to me similar to what you were saying, in that there was a point in time in which God may have revealed himself to humankind. And that point was perhaps Adam. And at that point, sin became different than it had been previously.
Yeah.
Or to people outside the garden.
Yeah, I think what you're meaning to say that is the homogeneous. And this is like a big kind of if I were to, this is kind of like a debate within. Or maybe I won't. There's like this gray box.
Sorry, I'll close that.
No, so this it's from Dennis Alexander. He terms it homo divinus, in meaning that
oh, he's making his own
the
term.
divine
Okay.
human, the first
theological human. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
So yeah,
Right.
it's different. It's just the term he gives the first couple, the divine humans, those who know the one true God.
Right, and
Yeah.
I think Swamidass would say that like what the Bible says about sin is primarily directed at homo divinus, at people who are descended from Adam and Eve, people who were initially that God revealed Himself to, but we kind of transgressed that covenant. We disobeyed, and we have since been continuing to disobey that covenant, and we disobeyed that initial purpose and intention. So all our theology about sin is mostly applying to those cases, and it's an open question about how it applies to people who are committing sin-like behaviors but are not descended from Adam and Eve. And certainly, a very interesting and I think important question to continue to be discussed. But he would probably say we can still maintain like what we think about sin because we're all descended from Adam and Eve. So yeah.
I guess you can say like when Neanderthals are fighting each other, we're fighting each other, were they sinning?
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I think you would say like they were sinning because they weren't living the way God desires people to live, right? And so, but to reconcile, working off Dainel's point, God was intervening by making Adam to start to establish His rule and reign on the earth and show like Himself to humanity. Right, and that got messed up, and so He eventually came, and sent His only begotten Son. Right, like that's how I think you would bring it together.
Yeah, it is getting quite late. So again, I want to give an opportunity for people to leave if they want to, but this is really good discussion. And Finney, I see that you're still on this call. I'm really curious to hear any thoughts you have towards Josh's model. If like that like makes sense with you, if you, like what are concerns that you would have with it? Or he might be away right now, but
Can I just ask before I hop off, could you go back to one of the first slides from the theological perspective, like where David started out? It gives the Genesis 1 and the Genesis 2.
This one?
I think it's maybe 5. Sorry, 5. No, down more.
Or is it?
It was the one that said essentially like here's how this model could be, because here's Genesis 1 and then here's Genesis
this
2.
One.
Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's super helpful.
Yeah, again, like since we're on this slide, this is a very important point I just want to keep emphasizing. And under this specific model, Genesis 1 and 2 is talking about two different creation events with regards to humans. So again, to reiterate, Genesis 1 here is talking about the creation of biological humans in general, so the larger human population. And then Genesis 2 is talking specifically about Adam and Eve. And not everyone takes these two as being separate.
Yeah, so that's also a point that Josh would contend with. He would say that like Genesis 1, well, you can say they may be different, but a lot of people might have a problem with that, right?
Yeah.
So Josh would say that Genesis 1 is talking about creation across a broad geographical and temporal period. So it could include the creation of Adam and Eve. Like he says, maybe even the creation of biological humans was de novo. Like we don't know. I mean, that's scientifically not, you can't disprove or prove that. He's open to that. It's just that, the main difference is that like Genesis 1 is general, Genesis 2 is special. It's more a smaller scope. So, yeah.
I think there's an interesting parallel if you assume Adam and Eve were created or other humans, and God intended Adam and Eve to go out there and restore the world and somehow, I don't know, evangelize or somehow, right, like bring the fullness of what it means to be a human to other humans. There is a really interesting parallel between that and Jesus, right? If you think about it, the story started in a garden, right? And God created. God didn't create Jesus, sorry. So basically, this perfect human being, right, without sin, is supposed to, in obedience to God, supposed to go out there and bring restoration, right? Yeah. And Adam, in his case, failed to do that through disobedience, right? And notice the interesting thing too. In his disobedience, it's related to food, or he's not supposed to eat something, but he did, right? And Jesus also started his kingdom, if you will, in the garden, right? That's the final place before the cross, basically. And also during the Passover feast, right, in the upper room, he said, this is my body, right? This is my flesh, eat of it, and you will have eternal life, right? So that obedience, in a way, is that food, what you're supposed to eat. So one man was not supposed to eat something, he ate it. The other man told them, like, this is what you're supposed to eat in obedience to gain eternal life. And then through him, again in the garden, through obedience and suffering, he's bringing about a new kingdom and restoration to the world. So interesting parallel.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good typological parallel, and it's certainly one that would, that connection between Garden of Eden and Garden of Gethsemane, that's really interesting. I never thought of that before, but yeah, thanks. That's pretty insightful.
Yeah. It's also an interesting parallel between the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and all the temptations of Jesus following his baptism in the desert. Like I can't remember what they're called, but like the fruit of pride 40 of life.
Bread of life, right?
And they're the pride of life, the lust of the eyes, and something else, but in those scenarios, they experience the same temptations, which is an interesting parallel too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, even apart from the specific model, right? I mean, you might argue that this model, amplifies or strengthens certain of these parallels in some ways. Mm-hmm. But certainly, even apart from it, like, there's a really the reason why Adam is important. He's not just a side character. Is precisely because we see that in the history of salvation. God orchestrates history to recapitulate itself. And this is why Jesus is called the last Adam. He's not just a completely different kind of person. He is different, but he also does what Adam failed to do. And you might even say, right, you remember in Philippians 2, that very famous hymn that the Son of God did not consider equality a thing to be grasped. And he took on the form of a servant. That passage is almost alluding, I think, to the fact that Jesus, unlike Adam, Adam and Eve, they wanted to be equal to God, they wanted to be more than what they were, but Jesus did not. So definitely, I would say the entire Old and New Testament, there's lots of these parallels to Christ, which is why it's such a rich story, a very compelling one, not just a series of isolated incidents. Right. Do we have any more questions?
Hey, Dainel, do you have any resources on folks who just Christians who take a sort of pure theistic evolutionary view, and then Christians who take a young Earth view? So, because I think what Josh is trying to do here, right, is obviously reconcile those two. That's sort of the innovation that he's trying to bring here.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have a key resource that you'd recommend.
You mean to learn about the two views, for
1 and 2. Oh yeah, there you go. Okay. Yeah, it's this line.
So I would say, if you want to just the young Earth perspective, I think the most famous one is Answers in Genesis. They have a huge presence. They write a lot of articles advocating for their point of view, and so you can kind of take a look at that. Those who reject historical Adam, I would say Peter Enns and Dennis Lamoureux are the most well-known. Dennis Lamoureux would still consider himself evangelical. He's written, I think, several books about this. Like, I think I believe in evolution, I love Jesus, or something like that, and many books and many articles about that. Peter Enns, I think, is sort of used to be more conservative, but he started to question historical Adam, biblical inerrancy, and so on. So I think he's less interested in these kind of attempts to reconcile, but he is quite discussed a lot. Now, I think it is, if you really want to learn about this, I think you also should probably read like Dennis Alexander, or the book that Dita was talking about, Creation and Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? That gives you an example of an earlier attempt to reconcile the two, but without really getting into the issues of genealogical descent from Adam, because he didn't know about this specific scientific point. But it gives you a flavor of that. Like also John Walton in The Lost World of Adam and Eve. He has a chapter where N.T. Wright actually speaks about this as well, like whether Adam and Eve need to be the historical ancestors of everyone. And at the time he said they don't have to be. And you know, obviously, like with Joshua Swamidass as his ideas, you can kind of go further than Walton or Alexander did. But I think there's still kind of interesting, important views to really read about. And also at the end, what I recommended, John Collins, I think, is a nice. This book is quite a good summary of the different views, and also like he's like an evangelical view who's quite. He's quite. This book was written before Swamidass's work came out, but since then, like Collins has been quite sympathetic to Joshua's project, even though I don't know if he completely buys into it, but he's written some pretty good reviews of it. So this earlier book of his is also quite recommended, and it is quite insightful. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This has been really fascinating. I appreciate you giving this presentation and staying on to answer questions.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Enjoy your weekend.
Yep.
All right. Right. I guess since there are not many, we should probably end it.
Yeah. If I think it's a good time to end. Yep. But yeah, this was
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I challenge you to come up with a simple solution, simple explanation that someone at a soccer game can also understand.
Yeah.
But I think I got the most of it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Yeah. I think we can head out. I don't think Vinny is on the call anymore. So.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Bye.
Yeah. See you.